The night was colder than it had been in years, the kind of cold that crept under the skin and made every breath sting. The wind howled across the open plains like a wounded animal, rattling the barn doors and carrying with it a heavy, unsettling silence. Under the dim light of a lantern, Thomas Carter's arms wrapped tightly around her, his rough, calloused hands shaking as he held her closer. Her breath was warm against his chest, her words breaking the night in a desperate whisper. "Don't let go." Not tonight. For a moment, time froze. The storm outside faded, and all that remained was the sound of two fragile hearts beating against a world that had tried too many times to break them. Before we go any further, if you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the quiet strength of love, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to The Gentle Truth. Your support helps us bring you more emotional, real, and heart-touching stories just like this one. Now, let's return to that night, to a moment neither of them would ever forget. Thomas Carter had lived his entire life on that ranch, through summers that burned the land to dust and winters that turned the world to ice. His hands were tough from years of labor, his face weathered by the sun and wind. To most who passed through town, he was just another rancher, a man of few words and steady routines. But beneath that quiet exterior was a soul that had known deep love and devastating loss. Years ago, he had loved a woman who brought light into every room. Her laughter had filled the house like music. And then, in one bitter winter, sickness had taken her away. Since then, Thomas had lived in silence, his heart buried under the weight of work and loneliness. When Evelyn arrived, everything changed. She came to the ranch with nothing but a small bag and a letter of recommendation from a family friend. She had fled a life that had caged her, a marriage promised to a man she didn't love, a future chosen for her by others. The West was her escape. Thomas hired her to help with the horses and kitchen, never expecting that her presence would stir something in him he thought was long dead. At first she kept her distance, polite but guarded. But slowly, she began to leave traces of warmth around the ranch. Flowers in a cracked vase by the window, laughter that startled the silence, a soft hum while sweeping the porch. Thomas found himself noticing things he hadn't in years, the way the sun lit up the fields in the early morning, the sound of boots on wooden floors, the scent of fresh bread baking. Evelyn carried pain in her eyes, though she rarely spoke of it. He saw it in the way she flinched at sudden loud noises, in the way her hands trembled when the wind grew too strong. She was running from something, just as he was hiding from his past. And in that unspoken understanding, they slowly built a fragile companionship. One late autumn night, a storm rolled in without warning. The wind screamed through the valley, slamming shutters and toppling loose barrels. Thomas rushed to the barn to make sure the horses were secured. Evelyn followed, wrapping herself in a shawl as the rain began to pour. Lightning split the sky, and the old barn shuddered with each gust. It was then they heard it, a sharp crack in the distance, followed by the frightened whinny of a horse. One of the younger mares had broken loose and was struggling near the fence line. Without hesitation, Thomas grabbed a lantern and headed out into the darkness. Evelyn followed despite his protests. The storm was merciless. Rain soaked them to the bone, and the mud clung to their boots like chains. They found the mare tangled in a broken fence, thrashing wildly. Thomas moved in slowly, whispering soothingly, while Evelyn held the lantern steady despite her shaking hands. Working together, they freed the terrified animal and led her back to the barn. But by the time they returned, both were shivering uncontrollably. The lantern light cast a soft glow over the hay-strewn floor, their breath visible in the freezing air. That was when Evelyn suddenly stumbled, clutching her side. Her face was pale, lips trembling. The exhaustion, the cold, and the weight of everything she'd been running from crashed down on her at once. Thomas caught her before she fell. He pulled her close to keep her warm, wrapping his arms around her tightly as if the strength in his body alone could shield her from the storm outside and the storm inside her heart. She pressed her face against his chest, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Don't let go. Not tonight." It wasn't just a plea for warmth. It was a plea born from years of fear, loneliness, and a desperate need to feel safe. Just once. Thomas's hands shook as he held her. He had built walls around himself for so long that the act of holding someone like this again felt both terrifying and sacred. The scent of her rain-soaked hair filled the barn, mixing with the earthy smell of hay and horses. His heartbeat pounded against hers, steady and strong, as if promising her she wasn't alone anymore. The storm raged on, but inside that barn something shifted. Two broken souls, each carrying their own silent burdens, found refuge in each other's arms. The following days brought a quiet change. Evelyn grew stronger, her laughter returning little by little. She began telling Thomas bits of her past, about the family that tried to control her, the man she was meant to marry, and the night she rode away without looking back. Thomas listened, not with judgment, but with the understanding of someone who also knew what it meant to lose everything. And for the first time, he began to talk about his wife, about the winter that took her, about the silence that followed. Evelyn didn't fill the silence with empty words. She simply sat beside him, her presence enough. Winter arrived in full force, covering the ranch in a blanket of white. The storms grew frequent, but so did the warmth inside the house. Thomas found himself smiling more often. Evelyn found herself singing again. They worked side by side, feeding animals, repairing fences, baking bread, sharing stories by the fire. There was no grand confession, no sweeping declarations. Just two hearts, slowly finding their way to each other in the quiet. One night, near Christmas, another storm hit. But this time, Thomas wasn't afraid of the darkness or the cold. As the wind howled outside, he found Evelyn sitting by the fire, staring out the window. He wrapped a thick wool blanket around her shoulders and sat beside her. She leaned into him without hesitation, her head resting against his shoulder. And just like that night in the barn, he held her, not out of fear, but out of love. His rough hands no longer trembled. They had found their strength again in the act of holding on. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to The Gentle Truth. Your support helps us keep sharing emotional, inspiring stories about love, resilience, and the quiet moments that change everything. Before you go, tell us in the comments below. Have you ever had a moment where simply not letting go made all the difference? We'd love to hear your story.